Now, before we talk about the Hadith, we of course have to first talk about the Quran. Because if we're going to set up the Quran as the standard to judge the Hadith, we need to make sure that we're standing on firm footing with the Quran. And recently on the internet, the internet has been abuzz about the Quran and its reliability. And in fact, many of the problems that have come, in my view, are actually due to the hadithification of the Quranic story. And that actually causes some of the problems. So I want to push back against some of that and say that we are on firm footing when we use the Quran as this kind of criterion with which to judge everything else. It's the foundation of our religion. So I argue that the Quran, I mean, this is, who can argue against this? The Quran is the primary scripture of Islam, but it's also a quasi-historical text. That is, it is the earliest extant text that is available of Islam. And therefore, it is used by a historian, a secular historian, as much as a religious believer. And it's the most reliable source, and we'll get into that. The third point is that the Quran was a relatively close text very early on. It does not have the historical anachronisms in it that the Hadith literature would have. So we know that the Quran was a closed text early on because of the fact that none of the sectarian or political disputes that started right after the Prophet's death, none of that is mentioned in the Quran. And it really would have been if it was still open for addition and of manipulation from a theological standpoint. So we do know that the Quran, is an early reliable text, and we can rely upon it. Now, of course, this wasn't always taken for granted in the Western Academy. In fact, in the 1970s, there were what we now call extreme revisionists who claimed that the Quran was not a text that was from from the Prophet's lifetime, but in fact it developed over the course of maybe 200, 300 years after the Prophets. And it may not even have developed from the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina, but in fact outside of it. In fact, I wrote an essay in class once, and I jokingly was summarizing their views, and I said, quote, what we know for certain is that the Quran was revealed either east, west, or north before the Prophet Muhammad was alive or after the Prophet Muhammad was alive. But what we can say for certain is that it was not in the Hijaz and not during the Prophet's lifetime. I'm caricaturizing their viewpoint, but it was almost as if they were going out of their way to insist that the traditional narrative of the Quranic compilation is unreliable. Now, this extreme revisionism is no longer fashionable. A lot of scholarship has come out after this and pushed back against this, and this is no longer considered. This extreme revisionism is now considered fringe. I do think that we have to give credit, though, that this kind of thinking in the Western Academy did have some fruits. They think outside the box, and it's not the case that all of their insights should be thrown out in the garbage can. In fact, they helped revitalize the field, even if their actual findings were kind of discarded. So this extreme revisionism has fallen out of favor due to a number of factors. But most importantly is all this manuscript evidence that's come to light in the decades after the 1970s. We have very early Quranic manuscripts that show that the Quran was already there at that time. And then, of course, the lack of historical anachronisms that we talked about, and we'll talk about a little bit more. These are the two kind of very strong reasons, and then there are other reasons too, like we can talk about the linguistic style of the Quran. It's that old Hijazi style. There's stylometric analysis that's been done on the Quran by Benam Sadeghi, which indicates that it's likely by one author, and there's even epigraphic data. And there are all sorts of other reasons why we have to reinforce the idea that the Quran is indeed during the lifetime of the prophets, and that it was compiled, it seems like the traditional narrative in the time of the third caliph, Uthman. That seems to be very plausible. Fred Donner is one of the scholars who pushed back against this extreme revisionism, and he points out the glaring lack of historical anachronisms in the Quran. and we can contrast that to the hadith literature, which is full of historical anachronisms. So I picked this list of historical anachronisms. I didn't pick it myself. What I did was I said, let me let the traditionalists speak for themselves. So I went to Yaqeen Institute's website, and this is Sheikh Muhammad, who has this article on the prophecies of, that are in the hadith. And I think we have to be quite gullible to believe all of these, these historical anachronisms. They just, I think you have to really park your brain to believe any of this, especially when you can contrast that with the Qur'an, which doesn't engage in this sort of fortune telling and prophesizing. In fact, the Qur'an says the exact opposite. The Qur'an tells the prophets that to say that I do not know the unseen. I do not even know what will happen to me, let alone anyone else. All the Qur'an does is talk about the hereafter and that the fact that the hour will come, but it doesn't give these sorts of kind of fortune teller predictions, which I honestly think demean the prophets, makes them like a fortune teller, like Nostradamus or something. And I think it's a little bit of gullibility, and I use that in an academic sense. I don't mean it in a pejorative sense, to say, this is the conclusion that the Sheikh comes to at the end, quote, given the number and precision of these prophecies, they must be seen for what they are, irrefutable proofs of his prophethood. I mean, if this is your mentality, I mean, what can I say? But if we're going to talk about the Quran, so we say first that it's devoid of these historical anachronisms, none of this fortune telling. There's only one example that's debatable about whether it talks about the future, and that's about the Byzantines. And there's, we can talk about that some other time. But aside from that, it's completely devoid of any of that kind of fortune telling. And then the second thing is we have all of these manuscripts. So I practice saying his name, and I know I'm going to get it totally wrong. But Dr. Van Putten, he's available on Twitter. He has a great podcast interview with Bottle Petrichor that you should listen to, where he gives a sober academic analysis of what the evidence tells us about the Qur'an's transmission and preservation, and he concludes in it that the Qur'an is, on the whole, well transmitted and well preserved. And this is even if we cannot come all the way back to the traditionalist picture, which we will talk about. And I think that kind of extremist view, or extreme view, maybe not extremist view, comes a little bit from this hadith paradigm that is then being superimposed onto the Quran. So all this talk about mutawatir, this is, that itself was imposed on hadith, and then hadith imposed it upon, the Quran. So my assessment of the Quran from a historical standpoint is that the Quran is a very well transmitted and well preserved text with only very minor variants, as one would expect from a very well transmitted and well preserved oral text, which always had a written component to it. And there are absolutely no theologically important variants. So this is my overall historical view. From a theological standpoint, I say the Quran is inspired, inerrant, infallible, and authoritative. Now, it is a little bit circular logic to use the Quran to justify that the Quran is, preserved. So I'm not making that sort of argument. But what I am saying is that many Muslims look at this verse 15:9 and use this as the standard. Even if there's a debate about whether this is actually talking about the preservation of the Quran or whether it's just talking about the Prophet being able to memorize it and deliver it. But I think as Muslims, as believers, we are wholly justified in saying that this prophecy or this kind of promise is fulfilled, that God's hand has been on this entire process of preserving the Quran. And the evidence for that is that sober academics have had, even the revisionists have had to revise their opinions, but Western academics have to admit that the Quran is well transmitted and well preserved. And so this is nothing but a fulfillment of this kind of promise from God. A lot of people have quoted Professor Shadi Nasir's work. He's a professor here at Harvard. And I don't think they have actually read his work. And he does quite good scholarship. He wrote in his recent book, there is no reason or evidence to suggest that the Quran underwent intentional textual changes so far as word manipulation, additions, or omissions are concerned. And this is from the book that people are using on the side to kind of criticize the Quran, this is what this book says. All right. And that's what the promise in the Quran is protecting against. The idea that anyone could intentionally manipulate the Quran, add or subtract from it intentionally. And so that is kind of a rejected view. Not amongst all Western scholars. Of course, there are going to be Western scholars who are going to, but I would say a majority of scholars will admit that the Quran is well preserved. And then Professor Nasser writes, the stabilization of the Quran. So even though we're acknowledging point number one, the second point is that the stabilization of the Quranic text was a collective communal process that took place over decades and with multiple generations of scholars. This is as far as the voweling, diacritics, recitation is concerned. So even though the Quran itself, like from a theological, conceptual standpoint, is a closed off text from the very get-go, this kind of, you can say the decoration on the rasam, is something that will require a communal process that goes on over a few generations, and we should not be shy about this. This is nothing to be embarrassed about. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning Quran in a talk about Hadith is because, unfortunately, one of the main arguments of Islamic traditionalists, I've gotten this quite a lot, actually, and it's kind of said with this arrogant attitude of as if I don't know anything, or people who question the Hadith don't know anything. They're like, well, if you're going to question the authenticity of the Hadith, then you're also impugning the transmission of the Quran, since according to them, the process was the same and the carriers of both were also the same, that is the Sahaba. This is it's a false argument. And it's also a little bit disturbing to me that the traditionalist camp would tie the integrity of the Quran to the weak foundation of the Hadith. That is, they are so dedicated to their sectarian viewpoints. Their dedication to Hadith is so strong. They want to so strongly to battle the Hadith skeptics like me, that and the Quranists as well, that they are willing to just toss the Quran to the side by making such an argument. The reality, though, is that the Isnad paradigm, which is the Hadithification that I'm talking about, was only later applied to the Quran with that Hadithification that happened across all fields of Islamic learning, by the way. That's why later scholars would judge the Sirah literature as being not as strong as the Hadith, because you were using the criterion of the Hadith scholars to judge the Sirah, even though the Sirah, they had their own criteria that they used. So why are we judging one genre with another? That doesn't make any sense. Similarly, we shouldn't superimpose criteria upon the Quran, and then this causes all sorts of problems. The other thing is that the canonization of the Quran was completely different than the canonization of the Hadith. It couldn't have been more different. The canonization of the Quran started immediately after the Prophet's death. It started with Caliph Abu Bakr, then immediately with the third Caliph, Uthman, who is the major figure. And these were state-led, massive caliphal projects. Whereas Hadith recording and transmission was actually banned by the early caliphs, especially by the first two caliphs, as we'll see, Abu Bakr and Umar ibn al-Khattab. Also by Uthman and probably by Ali as well. So we see that it's not the case that Hadith was transmitted in the same way. This is just a mantra that's being repeated, and it's quite an unfortunate mantra. Now, as far as the compilation of the Quran is concerned, what we can say about the traditional sources about the story of the Quran being compiled, we can say that they paint a very plausible story. That is to say, it doesn't seem that somebody would fabricate all of this stuff. Why would you do that? They were very honest in what they recounted. And some of this stuff is what's being used by kind of anti-Muslim forces now. That's how we know that this is, it's unlikely this story to have been completely concocted. There might be some sort of flourishes here and there, but for the most part, I think we can take it as plausible. It's important to keep in mind that the Quran has always had an oral and a written component to it. So both. There were 5 massive canonization projects. This is, again, something that we should take great pride in, that the community was always so dedicated to standardizing and preserving this Quran. So the first projects were led by Abu Bakr and Uthman. really by Uthman, the third caliph. That's where the Mus'haf, the Uthman is, that we all follow, the Rasm, the consonantal script, that we owe to the third caliph, Uthman. Then there was the other canonizations, as you see, are just about recitations. So there was the 7 canonical readings by Ibn Mujahid, then the 2 Rawi system, and then the 3 additional canonical readings were added. And then finally, in the 5th period, which is the 5th canonization, which happened all the way in 1923, this was the standardization by Al-Azhar that was done in Egypt. This is the text that you and I are most commonly familiar with. So because of this canonization process was so successful, unfortunately, some Muslims went to an extreme and felt that the text that we have from that 1923 standardization has always been exactly like that. But that is, again, even though the consonantal script goes all the way back to Uthman, the diacritics, the voweling, anybody who studies Arabic knows that, when you have unvoweled text, where you put the, diacritics, it's tough to decide where to put them. But often they don't change the actual meaning, and we'll talk about this. Now, I did get a question, again on Twitter, why didn't the Prophet commission an official Qur'an? Surely he could have done that, right? I think this is because we need to change our mindset about how we understand the Qur'an. Today, we understand the Qur'an as a closed text between 2 covers. That is, we have a very bookish view of the Qur'an. But during the Prophet's lifetime, the Qur'an should be understood as process. It was an ongoing, open-ended, dynamic, and responsive revelatory dialogue between God, the Prophet, his community, as well as those who opposed him amongst the pagans. So the Quran was responsive to the circumstances that were happening in the Prophet's lifetime. This book understanding of the Quran is a later development. And this book form that we have, it's trying to capture the live and dynamic process and pass it on to all posterity. The Quran simply couldn't be compiled in some final form during the Prophet's lifetime because the possibility of revelation existed as long as the Prophet was alive, right? Because it was an ongoing dynamic process. So immediately after the Prophet died, that's when it is said, according to the traditional sources, that the first caliph took an initiative trying to preserve the Quran in a book form. Of course, it should also be pointed out that Quranic verses were written down on various objects during the Prophet's lifetime. This is also very strange because I see some sort of this criticism from anti-Muslim folks who kind of make fun, some ex-Muslim folks who make fun of the fact that the Quran was written on all these different objects like bones and well, they didn't have paper. What do you expect? This is such a presentist argument. That's one of the reasons why they didn't have a written copy of it. Another reason, so early on. Paper only came much later. My final takeaway, from a modern historical critical perspective, the Quran is a reliable source that can be traced back to the life of the Prophet Muhammad. It is indeed our most reliable extant text to know about the prophets. From an Islamic theological perspective, we can affirm that the Quran is God's word as inspired to the Prophet Muhammad and is inerrant, infallible, and authoritative. God's hand has been over the Quran's preservation, which he directed through the concerted effort of the Prophet's community from a very early period. And the proof of that is that even modern historical critical scholarship affirms that the fact of the Quran is well preserved. And my last slide in this section is to reiterate that this in no way can be compared with hadith preservation. The early caliphs, especially the first 2, banned the recording and even the transmission of hadiths. This is at least what the evidence tells us or indicates to us, whereas they exerted every effort in the preservation and recording of the Quran, especially the third caliph. So to reverse what the traditionalists say, we can say that the same people who sought to record, preserve, and transmit the Quran were the ones who banned the hadiths from being recorded, preserved, and transmitted. That is to say, Umar ibn al-Khattab, is one of these examples, or at least he is attributed to be this way. The Quran was secured by early large caliphal and state projects. The Quranic script was secured to a large extent at a very early stage. In other words, there is nothing like the canonization and standardization process that Uthman engaged in as far as hadith goes, at least in the early period. Historical scholarship affirms the preservation of the Quran and that it goes back to the personality of the Prophet Muhammad. Whereas this is not the case with the Hadith, even if it can be accepted that some words of the Prophet may indeed have been recorded during his lifetime. That is to say, even the most sanguine Western scholars, such as Harold Motsky, would not actually say that the Hadith, goes back verbatim to the Prophet. All they're arguing about was it the first generation, second generation, or third generation. But almost nobody takes this back to the Prophet. And the proof is in the pudding. If you look at Quranic studies today as a discipline, and you're reading, any works by the major scholars in Western Quranic studies, almost nobody is going to take the Hadith as proof texts. It's just willfully ignored, and that's the biggest proof that it's not taken as historically going back to the Prophet, but rather it is seen, rightfully so, I think, as coming later, and it does tell us important information about what the early Muslims were thinking and believing, how they conceptualized and imagined the Prophet, and in that way, the Hadith is important for us, but not as a scriptural source that comes from the mouth of the Prophet. And this is my main argument. Okay, let's get into the meat and the potatoes of this lecture, which is the authority of the Hadith.